Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Sami Jimen Marrero from Urbender, and behind our mixer is our producer, Chris Majoka from You Do You.
I'm so excited today to have my dear friend, sister, priestess, shaman. You're just fabulous. Sandra Guzmán. She's an award-winning, Emmy-winning journalist, producer, writer, author, and she's just fantastic. Y ese campanario.
I live on the campus of a high school, boarding school where my husband works. And this is a sign that classes ended and a new class will begin in 10 minutes.
Oh, no, class is beginning now because this
So
podcasting, that's the signal that a new class is beginning like right now, you know? And thank you, Sandra, for coming on. I Have Something to Say. This is way long overdue, but there aren't any coincidences. I think that the timing is absolutely perfect. How are you, Mama?
I'm really, I'm filled with a lot of different emotions. And the first thing that comes to mind is I'm filled with joy because I'm in the present moment and I'm seeing your beautiful face. And I love you and I respect you so much. And I'm excited to share this moment with you. And I am concerned about all the things that are happening in the world, from climate change to monsters being in power in many countries. I'm concerned about the elderly, who 8 out of 10 are succumbing to COVID-19. So there's a lot of different throughout the day, there's a lot of different experiences and emotions that I have. But right now at this moment, I could say that I'm happy and I'm happy to be here with you. Can I do something? Can I light a little Palo Santo and bless our time together?
Yes, of course.
Love just the idea of centering ourselves, of creating ritual around conversation, creating ritual around coming together and, blessing the space, blessing you. May you always be filled with health and joy and strength and courage. And same for me. And may the ancestors always walk with us and protect us.
That's wonderful. Yes, totally. And that's a big part, right, of your journey. I know that you're a storyteller. Since you were a little girl, we've had this conversation many times, that que esta nena no se calla, right? She just won't shut up. She wants to tell stories all the time. But it's a gift that you have, and you use it wisely and with purpose. And that's why I love you. I appreciate you. And I'm actually not surprised at all the accolades and recognitions that you've received, throughout your careers, because you're fierce and you're unapologetic and you could just go through. You don't beat around the bush. You just go straight to the point. I was so, like we were talking a little while ago about the first rendition of your book, right? The Latina's Bible to Love, Spirituality, Family, and La Vida. This is the new version that was written in 2011, but the original was in 2003. So you provided a lot of insight. It's such a great read, about how to, as women of color, because I don't think it applies just to Latinas, how to navigate, this modern world, that is really established, under a patriarchy. That's basically it, right? And then how we're introduced from diverse cultures into this American society and fitting in essence. I feel like that's like the essence of the book. And so what made you think of this, like you were way ahead of the curve, like everyone's talking about women empowerment and about, modern day Latinas or women of color in leadership. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what made you dive in headfirst into this topic?
First of all, I am a storyteller, and I trained myself, or I trained in storytelling through the storytellers in my family. We did not and do not tell stories. We in the Caribbean, we in the indigenous Caribbean, we in the indigenous world don't tell stories necessarily in books. We tell them in circles with the elders. And there's usually one or two people in the family who are in charge of kind of knowing those stories, who make it their business, or who are blessed, or who are tapped, or who inherit the gift. And they sit at the feet of the elders, and then it's their responsibility to then pass it on to the next. So as a little girl, I was always interested in stories. And so I'd ask the adults to tell me about whatever it was that I was curious about, whether it was the color of a passion fruit flower to the star, the planets that shone overhead. I was always just very curious. So that's kind of like my training as a little girl in Boriken. And Boriken, of course, if people don't know, is the original name of Puerto Rico, which is the colonized name of the island. And one of the first stories I heard was my mother told me that the only thing that Christopher Columbus discovered was that he had a dirty ass. That he had a smelly ass and that he smelled. So my indigenous mother said to me, and I don't know why they call us Indias. We're not Indias. We're Boricuas because she's Boriqueña, right? So
yeah.
And I didn't know all the things that she was telling me. But now it just all makes sense. So she's very happy that his statues are being torn down. She's like, he came to cause trouble.
Yeah.
And anyway, so I wrote this book because I had been the editor of Latina magazine at the time, and I would receive letters from readers, emails, handwritten letters when people still wrote handwritten letters, asking me questions. Letters to the editor came in. There were a lot of conflicts between mother-daughter. There were lots of conflicts about how do you journey through modern day office settings without giving up your culture. And I resonated with those questions because those were the same questions that I was living, grappling with, journeying, resolving. And when I leave Latina magazine, I wanted to have a more intimate conversation with myself and with readers and respond to some of these conflicts and some of these concerns that I was experiencing as a first generation Caribbean immigrant in the United States who was also Afro-descendant and indigenous descendant, right? So it wasn't like I could just easily fit into the whiteness of and pass. Lord knows I tried. I learned English by trying to speak like, one of the white girls I used to listen to on television from the Brady Bunch, Marsha Brady. And so I totally can do the Marsha Brady accent. And so that's how this book was born. It was born out of a desire to explore some of these themes that I was experiencing and explore them in community. Because then what I did was I started to talk to women from Latinas from 16 years old to 67 years old about some of the issues that I touch on, from sexuality to family to rituals to tradition to this is a very
relationships. Yeah.
relationships with your mother, relationships with your lover, with your sister friends, with your family. What I envisioned when I wrote the book was sort of the external journeys, like sort of this is me living in the world. So as a professional, as a student, as a woman, how do I present myself? And also the internal conflicts, the internal conflicts. Do I feel beautiful enough? Do I feel like I'm enough? Depression. Well, that was the second edition, the depression, because that was a topic that I found was very resonant. So that's how the book started. And I was telling you earlier that you mentioned one of your favorite chapters, and you were cracking up.
Yeah. Yeah, because it talks about everything, about like basically from cradle to end of life, everything in between. And one of the big components that really drew my attention is like this quest to find a man, right, in your life, and then finally you find him, and then you say, okay, and these are the things you should be doing if he happens to be Latino or a person of color. But then you say, but what if your soulmate is white American, like a white dude, right? Then what you do? And so then you point out like 10 different things before you basically, move forward, that you should keep in mind, because they can bring, they can surface later on and bring a whole other level of issues, right? And you go into that too. And number three was, has he checked his white privilege? And I was like, wow, you wrote this book in 2003 and you address this as something that needs to be, talked about, and I was like, wow, and everyone, that's like the thing now, right, with racial injustice. And finally people, I mean, a tragedy had to, several tragedies, had to happen, but this one recorded, for people to now, feel compelled to react and to really talk openly about, whiteness and the privilege attached to it. And so I just found it compelling that you were talking about this with regards to women of color marrying into, a white family, basically.
Well, first of all, white privilege is, I was going to say, is almost as old as dirt, but it isn't. White privilege kind of began in 1619 in this country with the first African enslaved people who arrived on the ships on the shores of this country. But it started earlier in the Caribbean in 1492. When the first three ships with colonizers arrived and stole about, some of the books say, from 500 to 2,000 indigenous Tainos, and enslaved them and kidnapped them and took them to Spain to prove that they had found this new land. And so white privilege has been around for a very long time. White male privilege has been around for centuries, so more than 517 years in the Caribbean, and then since 1619. And we have been, I am not, I don't feel like, wow, this is great. Like I was talking about it in 2003 when, James Baldwin was talking about it in the 1960s. Dr. Martin Luther King was talking about it in the 60s. Malcolm X was talking about it. For God's sake, Harriet Tubman was freeing, enslaved, helping free enslaved people. So this has been a constant in this country. What is exciting and transformative about the conversations today is that we see the visuals and we cannot be gaslit or we cannot be lied to anymore. As much as those who don't want to admit that this exists, these videos, these horrific videos that we are seeing of Black bodies being killed before us are proof. What more proof do you need that there is rotting in this society, and this rotting must be rooted out and transformed? But I think in relationships, when I started talking, I just to be clear, did not marry a white man. So I have no direct experience with this. Um, but I was noticing the statistics of marriages in the 1990s, and they have continued to, they have been consistent, which is out of every out of every three marriages, two Latinas are marrying outside the raza and the culture. And 80% of the men that they marry are white men. And in talking to some of my girlfriends who did marry white men, I asked them what were some of the conflicts that came up. Some of the men did not really, and this is the saddest part in the interviews, did not really believe that what their wives were experiencing was racism. Now, they thought, one of them, I remember clearly, they were driving through the Carolinas and just doing like one of those romantic, let's
Tours.
drive,
Yeah.
of America. And so she's Mexican and she's an indigenous Mexican. She's I think her father's German and her mother's indigenous. Well, she exhibits a traditional, indigenous Mexican. And it was 2 a.m. and they arrived in this sweet little hotel in the Carolinas. And I guess he was tired. A white man was tired from driving. And he says, baby, go check in to see if there's vacancy. And she says, this is in 2002 or one when I was doing the interviews.
Yeah.
And she says, honey, she knows, she's from Texas. She knows what it means to be in that body, a woman, a brown woman in the Carolinas. And she says, babe, I don't think I should go. Maybe you should go. Like, I'm afraid. And he just thought she was crazy. Like, why would you, like, you're like, and this is at the core of white supremacy, right? Is not, in white privilege, is not understanding the privilege you have in a Jim Crow South, driving with a brown woman. And so I should have put that to the very top.
Yeah.
But it's, it's in the mix. It's in that mix of the things you should talk about with somebody that you're getting to know who doesn't share your culture.
Yes. Yeah. Because and there's other things, that are in the book that are all very experience driven, in the sense where it's not a tangible thing, like a physical thing, like you have to have gone through that experience to know how that feels, and then one of the things that I think was very powerful too is about demystifying the role of women in society and that conditioning that we have, right? We've talked also in the past about how we like to always say, wow, this is it's a patriarchy, this oppression and this systematic racism, or the policies and everything, is built by men. But you also talk about the role of women in sustaining the status quo, so could you talk to me about your views and how you peppered that in and you pepper it in all your work, really, because you've done documentaries, you've done interviews, you've done a lot of writing, you're a contributor for NBC News, so you do a lot currently, but you've written for all of them, like CNN and Univision, Telemundo, English, Spanish. If you knew Mandarin, you'd write in Mandarin too. but talk to me about your views about the patriarchy, and what would it take, like what it takes to break it down, and start anew, so we can, like, I know it's deep, right? So we can really move forward and see real change.
Well, Okay. First, I want to say that white privilege also expresses itself in not just heterosexual relationships, right? But also in gay love. So the woman of your dreams can be white, and she can totally be into the white supremacist or her family, right? So this is not like a heteronormative experience. It's love, right? It's when you find love, right? And so I just wanted to say that. So the patriarchy. There's a story about, and I always go back to my origin story, which is being raised by a woman who understood her power, who did not spend her time trying to be subservient to men. My mother is the opposite of subservient. And so was my grandmother. And so was my great grandmother. In fact,
and so are you. Apple tree, right?
So the point is there is a lineage that I come from, and my great grandmother, and I'm actually working on a memoir about my indigenous grandmothers and my mother, and so my great grandmother Ramona Roman lived in a small village, and this is how we get rid of it. It's going to get to the core of like where patriarchy began and how we can start to dismantle it, right? And in indigenous culture, my grandmother lived in small communities. My mother was raised until she was 11 years old in a small community of 16 families, and she was la jeca. La jeca is the indigenous word for chief. Right? She was in charge. Like she was the authority. She didn't run for office. She lived a life with dignity and with intention and with grace. And as a result, people in the community respected her. And so with her sisters, they decided, a lot of things in the village. So this is the lineage that I come from. Come to learn that in our cultures, in our indigenous cultures, it is the women who decide who the male leaders are going to be, right? It is the women's circle who decides who, Agüevana, one of our great leaders in Boriquen, right? He was the great leader who fought basically and tried to be diplomat. He was a diplomat warrior. He was chosen by the women in the village of Quania, which is where my ancestors come from. So at the very root of who I am, that is who I am. I come from a lineage of women who have not been subservient to women, but equal. And the story is that when Europeans first arrived in the Caribbean, they were so shocked that the men would not do anything without first consulting with the women. And you know this because you're Boricua, right?
Yes. I better not.
Right? and they were just like, what? Like, what's wrong with these guys? Why, they don't do anything without first asking their women. Like, what kind of men are they? Well, they're strong men, right?
Yeah.
And so from the very beginning, there was always an equality and equality in the relationships between the genders. And so how do we get rid of this patriarchy? Well, it's so entrenched. It is so entrenched in everything we do, even in the way that we praise God. We hardly praise the goddess. And so in spirituality, there's, the duality, the father and not the mother. And so I think it begins with the self. So I believe very much in that first and foremost, before you can change the world and structures and systematic, you have to decolonize yourself. And the work of decolonization is ugly. It's ugly and it's painful and it's also beautiful. And so what you have to ask yourself the questions, how am I nurturing, enabling patriarchy? If I'm raising boys, am I raising feminists? Am I having conversations around women's objectification? Am I what are the messages that I am giving my sons and or daughters about the role of myself in the home, the role of the men in the home? And so that's the work I think that is most important for us as women. To begin then also simultaneously challenging the systematic ways in which all of this has been set up to benefit the white male. But it starts with the decolonization of yourself, of your soul, of your spirit, in order for you to be able to challenge everything else around you. Remember, it's ancient. It's more than 500 years old. This imposition of patriarchy, this imposition of God as being male, of God as being this monotheistic person in the male form. And I remember when I was a little girl, my father's mother had all of these virgins, and even like Jesus, but they were all Black, And when I went to Israel, I noticed that some of the ways in which the virgins were, they were in different colors. And it just struck me as I knew I was divine from a very early age, because even in my grandmother's home, and she had saints, they all looked like me. And then my grandmother from my mother's side, Angelica, she had all of these Indio statues, Indios. I know you've seen them.
Yes.
El Gran Indio. So, y la India. And so even when all of these spiritual talismans were around me, they always looked like me. They weren't blonde and blue-eyed. So my divinity was never in question. And so the work of decolonization is work that continuously happens in me, because we're all of us have been trained and programmed to see the world through a specific lens. And so it's about replacing those lenses and seeing the world through different lenses.
It's developing that ability, you say, to view the world through different lenses.
Yeah. And it's also, I think when I said it's hard work, you have to read, you have to study, you have to my teachers have been many. My most recent teacher, and she was able to do so much for me. May she rest in eternal light, Toni Morrison. And what she did for me was she decolonized language, because there's so much trapped in language. Language is so burdened. So she freed it for me, so that I can see the way in which language is used. And, I'll give you an example, like the ways in which, I don't know, a child who is whiteness, right? Let's just take white and what that means. What does that really mean? It's this construct, but it's burdened with so much history, right? When did this word white first begin to appear in this country to differentiate the people who were enslaved, or the people who would soon be enslaved, versus the indentured servants from Europe in the 1600s, right? So then you begin to see the way language was used to separate, to other.
And to establish and perpetuate, right? Almost to ingrain these concepts in our day-to-day. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Totally. Yeah, I know that you've, that you've um you're studious, you're curious about people. That as much as you love storytelling, you also love to listen. And so I know that this one of the latest documentaries that you did was with the late and great Toni Morrison. And so how was that experience, of getting like the wisdom directly, right, from the source? It must have been freaking amazing and magical.
It was amazing, magical. It was divine. I felt I was in the presence of an ancestor, a living ancestor. I felt I was in the presence of a brilliant mind. And I had lived, I think I've mentioned the story to you. I had moved to New Hampshire, to a very small community. And it was New Hampshire is the third whitest state in the nation, bordered by the second whitest state in the nation. So every time I leave my door, I cause a ruckus, like, where are you from? Who are
Yeah,
you?
yeah. What
And
are
so,
you?
yeah, are you Samoan? um, and so a friend of mine had done this really beautiful epic reading of another author from beginning to end, and she had told me about it. And so I was like, that's a very interesting thing to do, to read an author from the first novel to the last. I'd never done that.
Mm.
And living now, I didn't have a full-time job. I was a full-time freelance journalist, and I had more free time. And so I began this reading project, and I said, well, I remember my husband saying years ago, when he first met my relatives in Peñuelas, Puerto Rico, he said, your relatives remind me of characters in Toni Morrison novels. And I was like, well, what does that mean? Because I had read Toni, but I had really read Toni. And so
Right.
I was curious to find out what he meant. And, when I read her, I felt very much she was writing about the Black experience in this country,
Mhm,
Black America.
mhm.
But I very much felt that the story of Black Puerto Rico is parallel
Mm.
to the story of Black America. And racism and white supremacy speaks French, English, Dutch, and Spanish. And
Mhm.
so, in reading her, I just received so much information about history, about the interior lives of women, mostly of Black women, and it was beautiful to be in her company. And it provided for me a way back into my ancestors, a way back into the Caribbean, a way back into Borican. And so after reading her, I wanted to see a documentary about her life. And I was working with somebody who knew her, who had a friendship with her for many, many years, for 40 years, I believe. And I was shocked to learn that American Masters didn't have a documentary about her. And so I approached him and planted that seed. I believe I did.
Yeah.
And then the rest is history. And so when I'm sitting in front of her, in front of this woman, after you read an author and after you read someone like Toni, they become like a friend in your head. They
Mhm.
become
Yeah.
like her incredible imagination, her gift of writing. And then I read everything that she ever wrote. And anytime I would learn that she had something else, I would look it up and try to figure out how to get my hands on it. And so sitting in front of her and asking her about her life, what I wanted to do was ask her all the little questions I had in the in the journey of reading her work. Like, tell
Yeah.
me about this. Tell me about your life. I'm insatiably curious about everybody, whether you're famous and you wrote Pulitzer Prize winning books, or you're a humble farmer. I am really just curious about the human experience.
Mhm.
And so here I have before me someone who has given the world so much. And so I was very humbled, and I was a little terrified
You?
she she has a reputation. She had a reputation, and if you Google her interviews,
Mhm.
of cutting journalists who ask stupid questions. So so I did not want to ask any stupid question, and I realized in the conversation that I was having with her that I could not ask any stupid question because I understood her project, because I had already read her work,
Yeah.
and because she had been part of the decolonization of language. And
For
she
you.
just was,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
like she was the one that kind of just
Yeah.
finished,
Yeah. 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 Almost like a
that.
madrina or like a
Yes,
big sister,
yes.
and that unbeknownst to her, of course.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
she was
Yeah.
definitely a
Yeah.
mentor,
Yeah.
a literary mentor, a
Yeah.
mother mentor. And she reminded me a lot of my mother. She had incredible wit, and
Mm.
she has incredible wit. And she's from a generation, she was born in the 19 post depression, 1931, or in the midst of the depression rather. And she was born during a time where there wasn't shame about being poor. There was a lot of you didn't want to like upgrade your phone or upgrade your girlfriend. Like
Right.
you wanted to have health for your family. You wanted to have your family. You wanted to survive. You
Mm-hmm.
wanted to, praise a higher power. You
Mm-hmm.
wanted to create and leave the world in a better place.
A
So
lot like now, right?
yeah,
Like that. That's what we are. Yeah.
here we are again with these
Yeah.
basic values,
Yeah.
with these very essential values
Yeah.
that get to the core of who we are as humans. So she reminded me very much, when I met her in person, of my mother.
Right.
So we got along. So I felt, and I love elders. That's the
Yeah.
other thing. I met her. I met her when she was 86. So I
Yeah.
love elders.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was.
That's fantastic. And we were talking about the bond, between women, and how the mentorship. You talked to me, about your family and how all these strong women, and that's another thing that you also put a lot of value in your writings and in your book and in your friendships. We've known each other for, yeesh, let's not count, right? For
Mm-hmm.
way over a decade. and
Mm-hmm.
and we've talked about the power of that sisterhood. And when you see all these women also now advancing into positions of influence and areas where they can really effect change and do something, and that they're lifting their voices, and people are like, what is she? Well, who does she think she is? We're
Oh,
talking about Mallory and AOC, and we can just go on. And I'm talking specifically of women of color now, because women in general obviously are faced with, the patriarchy, but women of color, that's a whole other, level of challenges. So call them, yeah, instead of, bullshit, really, but challenges, right? That we need to navigate. And so, this sisterhood. I mean, la comadres. That you have a whole section called about the comadres connections, and comadres is like, in English, how would you translate that? Comadres is like your like a
co-mother, co-mother,
co-mother. Yes, literally, yeah, co-mother, like a
a
sisterhood,
co-mother.
but it's
Yeah,
like
you're
that you're
co
basically.
you're co-mothering each other and the children in the community.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And it's about nurturing. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
so much that's like packed into that term, you
Yeah,
know, and I think that it exists.
yeah,
That that notion, right, of
yeah,
co-mothering exists, I want to say, in most communities of color, if not
yeah.
all of them, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then, I've, my mother had a 75th birthday 2 years ago, and she has five children. So she asked us that she wanted a party. And when we asked her where, now we can all pool our money and do it at a fancy place and, hire a band and, do something very
Cater
special.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And where she wanted her 75th birthday was where the placentas are buried. Oh, because by the way, when when babies were born in our village, the placenta was buried so that we could never forget home, so that we
Wow.
would always be grounded.
I just got chills. Yeah.
And so in this community called Las Cucharas, where my mother was born and where the placentas are buried, where all of the placentas are buried, this is where she wanted the party. Now, in 1954, they were displaced from this community. There was a lot of humble farmers were displaced from their lands in this Operation Bootstrap. If you kind of delve into Puerto Rico's history, the industrialization of Puerto Rico began. They were eradicating poverty, when in fact what they were doing was removing this fishing village where we come from to work in the tuna factory. So the men stopped fishing for themselves and their families, and then they had to work for industrial
packing the
fish. But that's for the memoir, and we'll have another conversation when the memoir comes out. For the purposes of this interview, my mother wants this in this place, and this place is now a reserve, a natural reserve. It is stunning, right on the coast. There's all this bird life and all this fish life and a freshwater lagoon and the coast and this little sliver of land. And we managed to invite almost all the 16 descendants of the 16 families that she grew up with. The children, many of the women have passed on and the men, but the children live on. And I had purchased my gift for my mother was a journal that everybody who went to the gathering would write to her something, a message. And I remember giving the journal to one of her neighbors, her best friend, the house next door, my grandmother's best friend, the son of my grandmother's best friend. And he says, I'm too emotional to write, and my handwriting is not legible. He says, but can I tell you a story? Again, the storytelling.
Yeah, right.
Can I tell you a story and you write it? And so he begins to say, you're not my friend. You're much more than a friend. You are my sister. Do you remember when we were babies and I breastfed from your mother's breast and you breastfed from my mother's breast?
Wow.
He says, we are kin, we are family. And so I asked my mother, I said, Mommy, tell me about this. And she says, yeah, well, when Mommy was busy doing whatever, her friends would take care. And if she wasn't around, the baby needed milk, she would take the baby to the breast. Now that is the ultimate form of sisterhood. It is. I get so emotional that women did this for each other.
Yes.
We don't do this. We don't even breastfeed anymore, for God's sake. And I remember another time I went back after I had immigrated. I went back and I was in the balcony of the new house overlooking the ancestral lands. And a guy, walks by, rides by in a bike. I said, Mommy, and she says hello to him, and she goes, "That's your milk brother, hermano de leche." Have you heard that? Hermano de leche.
Oh yes, I have heard that term. Yes.
And I was like, my milk brother. What is that supposed to mean? And she says his mother didn't have enough milk. And there wasn't. You couldn't go to the store and get Similac in the 60s and the 70s in this village, and of course, I had plenty of milk and I breastfed him when she didn't have enough. And so this sisterhood is a part of my DNA, but I think it's part of all of our DNAs. And I was starting to talk to you, earlier about the fairy tales, the Western fairy tales, the patriarchal fairy tales that we teach our little girls. Cinderella had two stepsisters, and they were very mean to her. Yeah. And they were all in search of a man. And so they tried to hurt her so she couldn't get her man. And so from the very beginning, you as a little girl, you're taught this bullshit. Like my grandmother, Angelica, always told me, never fight for a man because there's enough fish in the sea. And then she said in the modern way, she says, and if you miss this bus, meaning a man, there's going to be another buzz that comes later. So the fighting,
Yeah.
the intra-sister fighting is really ridiculous. And I think it comes from not having enough, not feeling like, you can, and the ego,
Yeah.
steps in. But
Yeah.
at the core, the female friendships, the woman friendships are, I think, are the way in to a more just, a more equitable, a more fair world. Because
Yeah.
when children feel like they're taken care of, when they feel safe in the hands of the community, then we're all safe,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
that's sort of the undergirding their communities. We can't go back. I don't think we can go back to 16 family communities where
Mhm.
everybody does different things. Everybody's gift is on display, whether you
Yeah.
fish or you farm or you
Mhm.
cook or
And that you're
you.
leaning in on each other, and that you're
Yes,
leaning in on each other. That's
yes,
that's a little bit difficult. Yeah.
yes, yes.
But we can create that. I got to tell you, on the street that I live in, I know every one of my neighbors, and it's very diverse from Caucasian to Filipino, Latino, Dominican, Puerto Rican, Moroccan down the block. And we're all friends. When Scott's working in his outside on the woodworking, right? They, hey, could you cut this thing for me, tile? And we've learned to really, it feels like family, but then you have other people that say that, what, your neighbors, like you get along. And so I don't know if that's, I don't know what it is, but we've I think been intentional in creating these relationships and this sisterhood or this family, this extended family here, because mom's in New York, have family in Puerto Rico, in California. I mean, we're also dispersed. And I feel like we were just in need, at least I think that's how where I'm wired anyway,
Yeah,
that I
yeah,
have that need for
yeah,
family. Yeah.
yeah,
So there's
yeah.
something to be said to, of creating, and through that sisterhood is usually through the women around,
Yes.
and then everybody else comes together.
We
Yeah.
are the keepers of culture. We are
Yeah.
the ones that continue the culture. We are the ones that are teaching the children all the time. Like the men are as well, but
Yeah.
we have them when they're babies and we're informing them. And so yeah, and it's really makes me happy to learn that you have that in your
Yeah.
neighborhood. It's
Yeah.
it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And it's also, it seems like it's diverse,
Yeah.
and you're learning from each other,
Yes, it's
and
really
you're
great.
learning. And when I was a little girl, also growing up in Jersey City, in this building, I remember like my mother's neighbors would bring whatever they cooked so that
Yeah.
she can taste, and my
Yeah.
mother would say, oh, today I cooked like carne guisada. And so,
Yeah.
and I have that with my neighbor now,
Yeah.
downstairs,
Well,
like
that's
she's
what we do
Korean.
here. We do
Yeah,
that here too.
yeah,
Yeah. It's
yeah.
awesome. And then you've also always spoken about women being healers.
Yes,
And that's part of this too, the nurturing, right? The
yes.
healing, and that's a lot of what we need right now,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, back in the day before industrialization, when we all had a little patches of land, I actually believe that what ails the world at the very, 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 very core is our disconnect from nature, our
Mm,
disconnect from being in cycle with the moon. As women, we are,
mm,
28-day cycles, and what happens in our bodies as the moon is going, round and round. We are feeling it.
mm,
My grandfathers, my uncles, everybody who ever, um, you know, everybody who's connected to me, who harvested the land or the sea, did it in conjunction with the moon and the
mm.
stars and the cycles of, the earth. And
Yeah.
so, to the point about this disconnection, we feel so grounded when we walk the earth, when we walk into a forest. In Japan,
Mhm.
Sami, in the United States, they have that triangle, the nutritional triangle, like
Yeah.
things that's what you should eat,
Right, and like the order, yeah.
Right, and what you need for a healthy life, like exercise. In Japan, one of those things is to walk the forest 3 times a week. They call it forest bathing.
Okay.
And so what happens is you're walking in nature. You're walking with the trees, and the trees have a specific chemical that they release. It's a chemical that keeps them from rotting. I forget the name of it. It's a very long chemical, but it's released into the air, and that boosts our immune system. So we are walking the earth. We are listening to bird song. We are receiving fresh air. We're being grounded. After a walk in the park or a forest, you usually feel better. After a swim in the river or the ocean, you usually feel better.
Yeah.
So our disconnect from the earth, from nature, I think hurts us deeply. And so part of the healing that I think we must do is this healing of the earth, because right now we know that the earth is ailing. If the earth is ailing, we are ailing too.
Yeah.
Right? We have plundered the earth for fossil fuels needlessly when there's enough solar power to power the world. We have to use our imagination. We have to use the power of our intelligence and imagination to reimagine a world without fossil fuels. And it begins really with our relationship to nature. And the healing happens when we take the time to be in nature, to be quiet and to be still and to listen. And also nutrition. You and I have talked about this. Processed foods are killing us. You know, as convenient as it is to eat fast foods, these fast foods are wreaking havoc in us, right? We're not eating foods that come from the earth. Our bodies are perfect machines, and they're not meant to eat things that come out of boxes. They're meant to eat as much as we can fresh fruits and vegetables. And so there's that. Nutrition is very important. Water, clean water. You know, many of our communities don't have clean water. Detroit still doesn't have clean water.
I know. So when we're talking about social justice, it just encompasses all of these things.
It really
that
does.
The inequities are so visible.
Yes.
And so in every aspect of when you wake up in the morning until you go to bed at night, everything in between, you could pick it apart and show this is missing. But a big portion of it is, that idea of connecting with nature. I think you just made me think about how it also is a good space to be able to pause and reflect and to grow your sense of valuing life, because that's also directly impacts how we treat each other too, right, as human beings. So it's all interconnected, really, when you stop and think about it.
All of it is. Yeah. And the quality of the air. That one of the things I noticed when I first moved to New Hampshire was when I stepped out the door, I could breathe in deeply and exhale. And the air was different than the air in the city. I never stepped out of my building and breathed deep in, because I could have been smelling dog pee and and garbage. So in these urban spaces where we're living, there aren't enough trees. There aren't enough. There's not enough plant life for us to feel fresh air. And so the lack of clean water, the lack of clean air, the lack of wholesome foods, and you see how it is that we are ailing. And so the healing must begin. I mean, I have been decolonizing and thinking about these issues and experimenting and making choices about, whether I would rather not have a fancy car, but I would rather have really good food, right?
Yeah.
So these are choices that I'm making about how I spend my money and how I spend my time. And I want to also talk about not just food and water. I want to talk about the images that we are allowing ourselves to consume, the Netflix, the binging of shows, and then the kinds of shows that we're watching, the kinds of stories that we're seeing, the stories, the violence, the gore, the stories that don't place us at the center of epic journeys. They place the white man and the white woman and at the center of these journeys. And so the devaluing of our stories in most of the shows that you see on television still in 2020. And so for women and for men who are listening to this podcast who have children, to really think about what they're exposing their children to, what story, what fairy tales, what images, and for ourselves too, for women, you know, how are we consuming, you know, what are we consuming? I remember when I was at the magazine 15, almost 20 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, I forget, it's been 2 decades, but the images were so important. After studies have shown that after women look at Vogue and other fashion magazines, they feel more depressed about themselves. They want to be skinnier, they want to be taller, they want to be whiter, or they want to have different, you know, hair. And so it's so important to be cognizant of all of the images that you're seeing and that you're allowing yourself to consume, because they're creating stories in your head. But the exciting thing is that we have young leaders today, like Tamika Mallory, like AOC, who are just so intelligent and courageous and brilliant. And we have to support them as much as we can. Today, June 23rd, I don't know when this is going to air, is the primary in New York. And I hope and, you know, pray that all the voters go out there and reelect her, because she's doing, AOC is doing a really great job. And so we're living in a time, Sammy, of deep transformation. Personal, national, civic, global, spiritual. And if COVID has hopefully taught us anything, is that we can't keep away from each other. We'll find ways to connect.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, this is wonderful. Sandra, I'm so glad we made time. I know you're busy. We're always like running around, you know, with chickens, like chickens without a head, but this has been really great because I feel like this conversation you know, is offering up a roadmap, you know, of things to focus on to be able to decolonize yourself, you know, and I thank you for it. Salud, Dios te bendiga. Salud, Dios te bendiga. Salud, Dios te bendiga. Yes. So we'll do this again when your memoir comes out, because I wanna hear the stories, you know, and your takeaways from them, because I know it's gonna be very, very insightful and very powerful. I think you have that awesome combination that you don't see in a lot of people, and it's that you are okay with being vulnerable and then also powerful at the same time, you know, because you're just you. Eres un sol. I love you.
Oh, I love you too, Sammy, and thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. This has been such a joy. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so proud of you and what you're creating and the community that you are nurturing and empowering in Florida and beyond. And I'm just honored that co-creating in your space today.
Yes, mi hermana, my sister.
Yes, de corazón.
Te
Yo
quiero
también.
mucho. Okay.
Okay,
Un beso.
bye.
Bye.
This concludes this episode of I Have Something to Say. We want to thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. We're on Spotify and iTunes as well. There's more to come next week. And remember, if you have something to say, it's time to speak up.